year on the fourth Sunday of Easter, we read part of John chapter 10, where Jesus teaches that he is the Good Shepherd. And so every year, the fourth Sunday of Easter is known as Good Shepherd Sunday. And I think there's a wonderful alignment that's happened today, a Good Shepherd Sunday and Mother's Day on the same day. Because, of course, Jesus highlights in his teaching about the Good Shepherd the compassion and concern and the love that he has for all of us. And those are all things that we're giving thanks for today. Some of you have heard me tell this story before. It's one of my favorite Good Shepherd stories. It happened on my first trip to the Holy Land. We were on our bus. It's a true story. We're on our bus, and we're right outside of Bethlehem, and we see these shepherds walking. Their sheep are kind of single file behind them, and they're walking along the side of the road. And we had this guide who is this very big Palestinian guy with this huge, thick accent, and he's telling us that shepherding hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. You'll remember there's this part in John chapter 10 where Jesus says that the Good Shepherd leads the sheep, and he repeats over and over again that the sheep follow their shepherd. So that's exactly what we were seeing out the window of our bus. The sheep were following all these shepherds, just like Jesus said in John 10. So then we get into the town of Bethlehem. We're getting off the bus to go eat lunch, and we round this corner, and then sure enough, there's this sheep, and there's this row of sheep, this line of sheep, and this guy's walking behind them, not in front of them, as Jesus says the shepherd do. And so I said to the guide, hey, what's the deal here? I thought you said that the shepherd leads the sheep, but that guy's walking behind them, and in this really thick accent, he says, that's right, he is not the shepherd, he is the butcher. So a really vivid illustration that the Good Shepherd leads, and he never, ever asks us to go where he himself has not gone. Today's gospel, here's what Jesus says. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. The Lord teaches us here that the sheep get used to their shepherd. They spend time with him. They get comfortable with the voice of a single, particular shepherd. And then they come to trust his voice. Jesus tells us in this same part of John chapter 10 that the sheep, in fact, they won't follow a stranger. They run away from strangers because they do not recognize the voice of strangers. So what we've got to do then is listen very closely to the voice of the one shepherd of the one flock. Otherwise, these other voices in life that are competing for our attention, they will get stuck in our head. These voices then will drown out the one voice that we really need to listen for, the one voice that really matters, which is the voice of Jesus, our Good Shepherd. There's lots of noise. There's lots of voices that are in our ears that are competing with the voice of the Good Shepherd. Other voices that want our attention, other voices that, if we're not careful, often will lead us astray. So let's talk about some of these competing voices. I think one of the trickiest voices that competes with the voice of Jesus, and it's one of the trickiest because it's the closest to us, and this would be the voice of self. And you know the one, the voice inside that says, I know what's best for me, so I'm going to do what I want to do. That voice often gets us in trouble. We can tell ourselves our whole lives we know what we're doing, we know what's best for us, but if we're totally honest, we don't really know what's best for us. We don't know what will bring us the happiness that we so desperately long for. And what happens when we continually listen to the voice of self, we begin then to serve ourselves and serve our own egos, and of course we end up hurting ourselves and those around us. And so the voice of self, though it is the most familiar to us, it is not the most trustworthy. It's really ultimately the voice of a thief who wishes to steal us from the peace that passes all understanding that Jesus provides. So we do well then, and this is a really hard spiritual practice, but we would do well then to turn our own voices off, to stop talking, to start listening more closely to the voice of Jesus. Another voice that frequently competes in our minds with the voice of Jesus, it's the voice of popular opinion, wanting other people's approval. And this voice often also leads us away from the path of holiness. Because when we listen to this voice, we want to do what's popular, we want others to approve of us, we are on the very, very shakiest of all possible foundations. The ever-changing opinion of the moment. The voice of what other people think often prevents us from doing things that we should do. Sometimes it convinces us to do something we know we shouldn't. And it's all done for the sake of fleeting approval. And the result of listening to this voice over and over and over again in our life is the lack of self-awareness and the lack of true identity, true self-identity. Because only the voice of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, can bring us to know who we really are. And only His voice can save us from constantly seeking the approval of others. Lastly, perhaps the most vicious of all the voices that compete for our attention is the voice of Satan, who ultimately seeks to destroy all of us. His voice is the most vicious of all the voices that compete with the voice of Jesus. Fulton Sheen once pointed out that in the moment of temptation, Satan comes to us and pretends to be our friend. Go ahead, he says, do it, it's not that bad. Satan says, you can always confess it later. And then once we've fallen into the trap, once we've given in to a temptation to be less than we are, the devil then turns on us and says, look what you've done. You're worthless. You're miserable. You're not worthy. In this way, Satan is always trying to drive us away from listening to the voice of the Good Shepherd. So we've got to be very crystal clear about this. And we must run away from his voice because it is a deadly voice that can cut us off from God. So there's lots of voices that compete in life for our attention. We've got our work cut out for us here in not letting those voices get too much a hold of us. And the way we do that is to get more and more used to hearing the voice of the Good Shepherd. We've got to be real intentional every day to block out all of these other competing voices and make sure every day to reorient ourselves towards the voice of Jesus, who speaks to us in many ways. His voice is heard through his living word in the scriptures. His voice is heard in the guidance offered by the church. His voice is heard in the sacraments which communicate his life to us, particularly the Holy Eucharist that we celebrate today. The voice of Jesus is heard in the words of our brothers and sisters who sit near us in church this morning. And his voice is heard in prayer. in the silence of our hearts, when we take the time to hear him and to put away all of the distractions. The more we pay attention to Jesus' voice, the more familiar it becomes to us. And then all of these other voices that are in our ears, they'll be shown for what they are, which is the voices of strangers who do not care for us. The more we know the voice of the Good Shepherd, the more we will realize that all of the other voices that are competing with his voice, they lead to death, not to life. Only his voice can guide us to the green pastures, to the happiness that we are all longing for. Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me."